On the morning of my 80th birthday, I sat by the window of the cheapest room in the Fairhaven Senior Care Home, a room that looked out on the dumpsters and the delivery lot, and I waited for my 3 children to come. I had my good cardigan on. I had asked Rosa, the aide, to help me shave, and she had brought me a small paper cup of orange juice and squeezed my shoulder and said, "Big day, Mr. Delaney. 80 years. I told her my children were coming. All 3. I had reminded them each on the phone, and they had each said, of course, Dad wouldn't miss it. I sat by that window from 8 in the morning, and I watched the light move across the delivery lot, and I watched the shadows get short and then long again, and at 7 that evening Rosa came in quietly and turned on the lamp and found me still in the chair in my good cardigan, and not one of my 3 children had come. Not one had called. The only birthday card I received on my 80th birthday was a handmade one from my 16-year-old granddaughter and a second one, bought at the pharmacy, signed by Rosa and the night staff. People paid $11 an hour to remember me when my own blood could not. Stay with me, because what my 3 children did not know, what they had forgotten in their certainty that the old man in the cheapest room no longer mattered, was that every dollar they had spent that day, every dollar that bought the houses they lived in and the cars they drove and the lives that were too busy to visit their father on his 80th birthday, was still, by one unsigned page and one turn of a brass key, mine. And I was finally, after 2 years of waiting by that window, ready to take it back. My name is Frank Delaney. I want to tell you how a man ends up alone on his 80th birthday in the cheapest room in a care home, having given everything he ever built to 3 children who could not spare him an afternoon, because I do not believe I am the only one, and if you are one of the others, if you are sitting by your own window waiting for a call that isn't coming, then I need you to hear the whole of this. Because there is a thing I learned, too late to keep it from breaking my heart but not too late to matter, and it is this: money does not change people. It only gives them the room to show you who they always were. And the cheapest room in the home, it turns out, is the truest mirror a father will ever look into. Let me tell you what I built so you understand what was given and what was thrown away. I was born poor, the son of a man who drove a delivery truck and a woman who took in laundry, and I left school at 15 to work, and at 22 I married the only woman I ever loved, my Nora, and together we bought a failing corner grocery on Delancey Street with money we did not have and a faith in each other that we did. Store number 1, we called it, though there was only the one and we could not yet imagine there would ever be more. Nora ran the register and I ran the floor in the back, and we lived in the 2 rooms above it, and our first child was born in those rooms, and we worked 18-hour days for years, and slowly, one loyal customer at a time, that failing little store became a good one. And then we opened a second, and a third. And over 40 years, Nora and I built Delaney's Markets into a chain of 31 grocery stores across 3 counties, employing over 900 people, feeding hundreds of thousands of families. And we did it the way you build something that lasts, by treating the people who worked for us like our own and the people who shopped with us like neighbors, because they were. I owned the stores. I owned the land under most of them. Land I'd bought cheap and that had become, over 4 decades, worth many times what any grocery chain is worth. I was, though I never once said the word out loud and never once acted like it, a wealthy man. And none of it, not $1, not one store, would have existed without Nora beside me at that register on Delancey Street. Let me tell you one thing about Nora so you understand what kind of woman built that family, because it matters to everything that came after. In the 3rd winter of store number 1, when we were so far behind on the mortgage that I could not sleep, a hard freeze came and half the neighborhood lost heat, and the old people on our block, the ones on fixed incomes, could not get to the bigger markets across town. Nora, who was 7 months pregnant with Richard, loaded a wagon with bread and milk and canned soup every morning for 2 weeks and pulled it door to door through the snow. And she did not charge the ones who couldn't pay, and I remember standing in the doorway of our failing store watching my pregnant wife disappear into the white with a wagon of food for people who couldn't pay us, and thinking we were going to go under and telling her so. And Nora looked at me and she said, "Frank, we might. But if we go under, we're going under as the store that fed Mrs. Kowalski when nobody else would. That's the only kind of store worth having. We did not go under. Half of those old people became customers for life, and their children, and their children's children, and 30 years later grown men would stop me in the street to say their grandmother never forgot the young pregnant woman who pulled a wagon through the snow. That is how you build something that lasts. Not with money. With the thing Nora had, and I only learned from her. And that is the thing, exactly the thing, that none of our 3 children ended up with, though they grew up watching her have it, and I have spent a long time wondering how a woman like that could raise 3 children who would one day move their own father to a cheaper room to pocket the difference. I think the answer is that Nora was the thing itself, and the children mistook standing near it for having it, and when she died they discovered they'd never actually built any of their own. We raised 3 children in the aisles of those stores. Richard, the eldest, learned to count money at Nora's register before he could ride a bike. Diane, our only daughter, used to fall asleep in the stockroom on bags of flour while we closed out. And Kevin, the baby, charming Kevin, could talk any customer into anything from the time he was 6. I could give you 100 good memories of them as children, and they are all true, and that is what makes the rest of this so hard to carry. Richard at 9, so proud when I let him make the bank deposit alone for the first time, walking the 3 blocks with the bag clutched to his chest like it was the crown jewels, checking over his shoulder for robbers. Diane at 12, who cried for a week when a customer's dog died and insisted we put out a bowl of water by the door for every dog that ever came after. And we did, for 30 years, because of her soft heart. Kevin at 6, standing on a milk crate by the register charming quarters out of customers, until Nora caught him and made him give every quarter back, and he did it so charmingly that the customers tipped him more. These were good children. I want you to understand that because I think the temptation when you hear a story like mine is to believe the children were always monsters and the father a fool for not seeing it. It was not like that. It is never like that. They were good children, raised by a good woman in a good place, and something happened to them anyway slowly over decades, and the something was not a single betrayal but 10,000 small surrenders, each one so small it didn't count, until one day you add them all up and you are sitting in the cheapest room and the total is staring back at you. I have thought a great deal about when each of them turned, and I can almost put a finger on it. Richard turned when I made him vice president too young, and he learned that my name opened every door before he'd earned the right to walk through any of them. He came to believe the doors opened because of him, and a man who believes that will eventually resent the person whose name actually holds the doors. Diane turned when she married Gerald Voss, a man with old money and a cold family, and spent the next 15 years trying to scrub the grocery off herself to belong to them, until being ashamed of where she came from became simply who she was. And Kevin, my baby, I don't think Kevin ever turned at all because I don't think Kevin ever fully formed. I loved him too easily and forgave him too fast and gave him too much, and I made him, with my own soft hands, into a man who believed the world was a register he could charm quarters out of forever. Their mother would have caught it. Nora caught everything. But I was busy building stores, and I told myself that giving them everything was the same as raising them well, and it is the great lie of the self-made man, and I believed it right up until it put me by the window. I loved them the way you love the thing you built your life around. I told myself I was raising them to understand the value of work, of a dollar earned, of a family that stands together. I taught them everything I knew about building something. What I failed to teach them, and I did not understand this until I was sitting in the cheapest room, was the one thing I could not teach because I had never had to learn it myself. I had never had money handed to me. I earned every dollar against resistance, and that resistance had made me who I was. My children were handed everything, and being handed everything had made them who they were too. That is the quiet tragedy that no one warns a self-made man about. The very success you break your body to give your children can rot the character you were trying to build. Nora died 6 years ago. A stroke, fast, in the kitchen of the house we'd finally built after decades over the store, and she was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital, and I have not had a single day since that did not have a hole in it exactly her shape. And here is the thing I have come to believe, sitting by that window. Nora was the load-bearing wall of our family, and when she went, the whole structure began to lean, and I was too deep in my own grief to see it happening until it had already fallen on me. Nora was the one who kept the children human to each other and to me. She was the one who remembered every birthday, who called each of them every Sunday, who knew which grandchild needed new shoes and which one was struggling in school. She held the family together with her bare hands for 40 years, the way the best women of her generation did, invisibly, tirelessly, and none of us understood how much she was carrying until she set it down by dying and we all felt the weight land where she'd been standing. Within a year of her death, my children began, gently at first, to talk to me about my estate. It started with Richard because it always started with Richard. He came to me one evening, my eldest 52 years old, a hard and polished man by then, running the day-to-day of the company under me, and he sat me down with the particular kindness that I have since learned to fear, the kindness of someone who wants something and has decided to package it as concern. He talked about taxes. He talked about probate, about how much the government would take when I died, about how it would be a shame, after everything I'd built, to hand half of it to the tax man because I'd been too sentimental to plan. He talked about getting ahead of it, about simplifying, about dividing things now while I was alive and clear-headed, so that everything would pass cleanly to the three of them and nothing would be lost. And he said the thing that got me, the thing that got through the grief, because he knew me and he knew exactly where I was soft. He said, "Dad, it's what Mom would have wanted. She'd want it easy for us. She wouldn't want us fighting over paperwork while we're grieving you someday." He used Nora. He used my dead wife to get me to start signing away the empire she and I had built with our 4 hands. And it worked because I was lonely and I was grieving and I was 74 years old and tired, and I wanted, more than I can tell you, to believe that my children were thinking about the family, about each other, about what their mother would have wanted. So I said I'd think about it. And Richard smiled, and he squeezed my shoulder. The same gesture Rosa would make years later and mean 1,000 times more. And he said, "That's all I ask, Dad." The signing itself took place a few months later, on a bright morning in a conference room at Richard's lawyer's offices, and I remember it now with a clarity that is almost cruel. All 3 of my children were there, and they were, that day, the warmest and most united I had seen them since their mother's funeral, and a foolish, hopeful part of me thought, Look how this has brought them together. Nora was right, they're a family again. I did not understand yet that nothing unites people quite like the imminent transfer of a fortune, and that the warmth in that room was the warmth of 3 people about to be handed everything, which is a warmth that evaporates the instant the handing is done. They were attentive to me that morning. Kevin got me coffee. Diane held my arm. Richard walked me through each document in his patient, competent voice. And I signed, and I signed, and I signed page after page, moving control of 31 stores and 4 decades of land and the accounts of a lifetime into the trust, into their hands, and with every signature I watched my children's faces, and I told myself the light in them was love. It was not love. I know that now. It was arrival. It was the look of people reaching the end of a long wait. But there was one document I signed that day that they did not pay close attention to, because it was dull and technical and their lawyers had described it as boilerplate, the document that established the trust as revocable, that kept the whole thing quietly reversible in my hands alone. My children's eyes slid right over it. They were watching the pages that gave them things. They did not watch the page that let me take those things back. Why would they? They had already stopped seeing me as someone who could do anything to them. That, in the end, was the mistake that undid them, and it was made that very morning in the warmth of that conference room, while I signed away everything and quietly kept the one thing that mattered. Here is where I have to tell you the one thing that changes this whole story, the thing my children never understood and I never explained, because a man who has clawed a fortune out of nothing does not survive 40 years in business without keeping one card face down on the table, even from the people he loves. I did not build my caution to trap my children. I want you to understand that. I built it decades before, out of simple habit, the same habit that made me read every contract twice and trust the paper over the handshake. When I finally agreed to simplify my estate, when I let Richard bring in the lawyers and divide the operational control of the company and the properties and the accounts among the 3 of them, I did it through a revocable living trust. Everything went into the trust. The stores, the land, the accounts, all of it. And my 3 children were made the beneficiaries, given control, given the income, given the run of everything, and they walked away from that signing believing, because they wanted to believe it and because no one corrected them, that they now owned it all outright. But a revocable trust is exactly what its name says. Revocable. As long as I was alive and of sound mind, I could revoke it. With a single signed document, I could dissolve the entire trust and pull every asset, every store, every acre, every dollar, back into my own hands, overnight, completely and legally. My children ran the company. They spent the income. They lived like the owners of a grocery empire. But they did not own it. I did. I had never stopped owning it. The whole of the Delaney fortune hung, the entire time, from a single thread that only I could cut, and not one of my 3 children ever remembered that the thread was there. My lawyer at the time, a good man now retired, had made sure I understood exactly what I was keeping and what I was giving. And I kept it not because I planned for one moment to use it, but because keeping one card face down was simply who 40 years had made me. I signed away the appearance of everything. I quietly kept the reality of it. And then I waited to find out, though I did not know I was waiting or what I was waiting to learn, which of those two things my children actually cared about. I found out. God help me, over the next 2 years I found out. The change was not sudden. Cruelty rarely is, in families. It comes the way the tide comes, so gradually that you keep telling yourself the water isn't really rising, right up until you're standing in it. At first, with control of the company and the money in their hands, my children were attentive, even warm. They had gotten what they wanted, and gratitude, or the performance of it, came easy. But as the months passed and I became less a man who could give them something and more a man who simply needed things from them, the temperature dropped, 1 degree at a time. The Sunday calls, the ones Nora used to make and that I had tried to keep up in her memory, stopped being returned. Richard was busy running the company, my company, and had less and less time to discuss it with me, and then no time, and then a note through his assistant that he'd prefer I not just drop by the office. The office in the building I built, because it confused the staff about who was in charge. Diane, who had married a wealthy man and spent my money climbing into a social world that would have curled Nora's lip, began to find me an embarrassment. My plain clothes, my grocer's hands, my habit of talking to waiters like they were people. And Kevin, my charming baby, came around only when he needed money, which was often, because Kevin spent the way water runs downhill, and my fortune had simply given him a larger hill. I got old. That is the crime I committed against my children, the unforgivable one. I got old and I got tired and I fell one afternoon in my own kitchen the way Nora had, except I did not die. I only broke my hip, and while I was in the hospital my 3 children held a meeting I was not invited to, about me, about what to do with me, and they decided, the 3 of them, that it would be best for everyone if I did not go back to the house Nora and I had built. It would be safer, they said, at Fairhaven. It would be easier. And I was frightened and in pain and grieving and 78 years old. And when your own 3 children stand around your hospital bed and tell you in gentle voices that they've found you somewhere nice, somewhere you'll be looked after, you go, because the alternative is to admit that the people you built your whole life for want you out of the way, and no parent can look straight at that. So I went. They sold the house, Nora's house. They told me it was for the best, that keeping it was just money sitting there. And they sold the house Nora died in, with her garden and the kitchen where we danced, and they divided what it brought among the 3 of them, or rather among the trust they thought they owned, and they moved me into Fairhaven. And at first it was a decent room, a room with a view of the garden, because at first appearances still mattered to them, and a man with a fortune, even a man they'd tucked away, gets a room with a view. But here is the detail that tells you everything, the detail I still cannot fully believe even now. About 8 months in, the 3 of them, reviewing the expenses of the trust they believed was theirs, decided that my room was costing too much. And they moved me, to save money. Their own father, to save money that was not even theirs. They moved me from the room with the garden view to the cheapest room in the building, the small one at the end of the hall that looked out on the dumpsters and the delivery lot, because it was $200 a month less, and $200 a month of my own money was more than my children were willing to spend to let their father look at something green while he waited to die. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you something, because I have turned it over on every one of those long afternoons by the window. When you have given your children everything, your business, your money, your name, your whole life's work, and they respond by moving you to a cheaper room to pocket the difference, what exactly is it that you gave them? Did you give them a gift? Or did you simply hand a weapon to someone who was always going to use it on you? I am not asking rhetorically. I genuinely need to know what you think, because I got it wrong for 80 years, and I would spare you that if I could. Tell me in the comments where you think the line is between generosity and foolishness. Across it, I'd like to know if you can see it more clearly than I could. Rosa was the one who told me the truth about the room. She wasn't supposed to. The staff are careful about what they say. But Rosa Mendez had been an aide at Fairhaven for 11 years, and she had a mother of her own in a home 2 states away that she couldn't afford to visit as often as her heart demanded. And she and I had become, in the slow way of people who see each other every day, something like friends. She was the one who brought me coffee the way I like it. She was the one who wheeled me out to the real garden on the good days. She was the one who noticed, on the day they moved my things to the room by the dumpsters, that I did not understand why, and who found me later staring out at the delivery lot, and who sat down on the edge of my bed against every rule and told me quietly, "Mr. Delaney, I heard them. Your son on the phone with the director. He asked for the least expensive room you could be moved to. I'm sorry. I thought you should know it wasn't a mistake. I want to tell you one thing Rosa did because it is the exact opposite of the $200, and the two things side by side taught me everything. It was the first anniversary of Nora's death that I spent in Fairhaven, and I had told no one it was coming because who was there to tell, and I sat in the cheapest room that whole day the way I sat on my birthday quietly with the grief that never fully leaves. None of my children called. I doubt any of them remembered the date, though their mother had died on it. But in the evening Rosa came in after her shift had already ended, on her own time, unpaid, and she was carrying a small grocery store cake with a single candle, and she set it on my little table and she said, I looked at your chart. I saw it was your wife's day. I didn't want you to be alone on it. And she sat with me, a woman earning $11 an hour on her own unpaid time, and she let me talk about Nora for an hour, and she lit the candle and we did not sing, we just sat with it burning for Nora, and it was the single kindest thing anyone did for me in 2 years at Fairhaven, and it was done by a stranger. My daughter asked how much longer I had. My son asked for the cheaper room. And a woman who owed me nothing brought a cake with a candle so I would not grieve my wife alone. When people show you the difference that clearly, you should believe them, both of them, the cruel and the kind. Took me too long to believe either. And I thanked her, and I did not cry in front of her because a man of my generation does not. But that night, in the cheapest room, listening to the trucks back up to the dumpsters, I cried the way I had not cried since Nora died. Not for the room, for the answer. Because Rosa had just told me, without meaning to, which of the two things my children cared about, the appearance or the reality, and the answer was neither. They cared about the $200. There was one more thing worse than the room that I have not told you yet, and I will tell you now because it was the deepest cut of the 2 years and because you should know exactly what I was forgiving over and over in the name of hope. About a year into Fairhaven, Richard came for one of his 2 visits, the ones to make me sign something, and while he was signing me in at the front desk, he took a call and put it on speaker for a moment, not realizing or not caring that I had been wheeled close enough to hear. And it was Diane on the line, and I heard my daughter's voice say, clear as anything, Is it done? Did he sign? God, I can't do another one of these visits. The place is so depressing. How much longer do you think he's got? How much longer do you think he's got? My daughter, asking my son, over my own head, how long before I would die and stop being an inconvenience? And Richard, glancing at me and seeing, I suppose, that I looked confused and old and probably hadn't understood, said into the phone, Not long. The doctor says his heart's not great. We just have to manage the expenses till then. Manage the expenses till then. That was me. I was an expense to be managed until my heart, which had beaten for 80 years and pulled a fortune out of nothing and loved these 3 children with everything it had, finally did them the courtesy of stopping. I said nothing. I let Richard believe I hadn't understood. But I understood every word. And do you know what I did with it? I forgave it. That is how deep the hope runs in a parent. How far past all reason. I heard my children discussing my death as an accounting problem, and I told myself Diane was just tired, that she didn't mean it, that grief makes people cold, and I forgave it and went on waiting by the window. It took store number 1 to finally end the forgiving. A father, it turns out, can forgive almost anything done to himself. It was only when they came for the thing Nora and I built together that I finally understood forgiveness had become another word for letting them. And still, God forgive me, before that I waited. I want to be honest with you about this because I think the waiting is the part that people who have not lived it do not understand. I did not revoke the trust that night, though I could have, though I lay there knowing I could pick up a phone in the morning and pull my entire fortune back and leave my children with nothing. I did not do it because I was their father, and because hope is the last thing to die in a parent long after respect and even love have been worn away. Hope simply will not die, and I kept telling myself that they were busy, that they were grieving their mother too in their own way, that they would remember me, that Richard would call, that Diane would visit, that Kevin would come by even if it was only for money. At least it would be Kevin, at least it would be one of my children through the door. I waited by that window for 2 years. And in 2 years, do you know how many times my 3 children, the 3 children I gave a grocery empire, visited their father in the cheapest room at Fairhaven? I will tell you, and I want you to sit with the number because I have had to. Richard came twice, both times to have me sign something. Diane came once, at Christmas, for 20 minutes and spent most of it on her phone. and left when the smell of the place, she said, gave her a headache. And Kevin came 4 times, every time for money, every time leaving within the hour with a check drawn on an account he thought was his and was mine. That is 80 years of fatherhood, totaled up in the visitor log at Fairhaven. 7 visits in 2 years, not one of them for me. There was one person who came for me. I have to tell you about Maddie because she is the reason this story does not end in bitterness. And because she is the person all of this was finally, secretly for. Maddie is Richard's daughter, my granddaughter, 16 years old that year of my 80th birthday. And Maddie, alone out of my entire bloodline, came to see me. Not out of duty, not for money. She took 2 city buses every second Saturday without telling her father, who would not have approved of the time spent on a grandfather who no longer served any purpose. And she sat with me in the cheapest room and she did her homework at the little table while I read. And she told me about her life and she asked me to tell her about Nora, about store number 1, about the old days again and again, because unlike her father and her aunt and her uncle, Maddie understood that she came from something and she wanted to know what it was. She was the one who made the handmade birthday card, the only real card I got. And it was Maddie, without ever intending to, who finally moved me from waiting to acting. Because it was Maddie who let slip, one Saturday, the thing that made me understand that my children had not simply forgotten me. I want to give you one Saturday with Maddie, so you understand what my children threw away without ever noticing it was there. It was an ordinary visit, gray outside, the trucks backing up to the dumpsters, and Maddie was at my little table with her history homework, and she got stuck on something, the Great Depression, and she asked me, because I am old enough to be a primary source, what it had really been like for my parents. And I told her about my father driving his delivery truck and my mother taking in laundry, and about how they never threw away a heel of bread. And Maddie put her pencil down and listened with her whole face the way she does, and then she said something that has stayed with me. She said, "Grandpa, why doesn't anybody else in the family know these stories? Dad never tells me anything about where we came from." And I didn't have an answer for her, or I did, and it was too sad to say to a 16-year-old, which is that her father had spent his whole adult life trying to forget where he came from because where he came from had grocery store linoleum under its feet. So instead I told her more stories about Nora and the wagon in the snow, about the night the first store finally turned a profit and Nora and I danced between the aisles after closing with the lights off so no one would see, and Maddie laughed and asked question after question, and filled up 2 pages of a notebook she'd started keeping. "So it doesn't get lost?" she said, and I looked at this child writing down our family the way you'd save something from a fire, and I understood that. Everything Nora and I were, all of it, had come to rest in this one 16-year-old who took 2 buses, and in no one else. My 3 children had inherited the money. Maddie had inherited the meaning. And only one of those things can take 2 buses to sit with an old man in a gray room on a Saturday for no reason at all except love. They had begun to feed on the things I love. She didn't know it was a secret. That's the thing about the young. They assume the adults have already told each other the important things. She was doing her homework at my little table, and she mentioned offhand, sad but not thinking it would land the way it did, that she was going to miss the old store. I asked her what she meant, and she looked up, surprised I didn't know, and she said, "Store number 1, Grandpa, on Delancey. Dad and Aunt Diane sold it. There's going to be condos. They're knocking it down in the spring." And the room went very quiet and very cold, and Maddie saw my face and understood, too late, that she had told me something no one had meant for me to hear. Store number 1. The failing corner grocery on Delancey Street that Nora and I bought with money we didn't have. The 2 rooms above it where our first child was born. The register where Nora stood for 18 years. The floor I mopped 10,000 times. The place where the whole of everything began, the seat of the entire empire my children were now living off of, the one piece of all of it that was not really an asset at all but a sacred thing, a monument, the closest thing to a grave that Nora and I shared besides her actual grave. My children had sold it to a developer to be demolished for condominiums, and divided the money and had not told me, had not thought I needed to know, had not imagined that the old man in the cheapest room would care that the beating heart of his whole life was going to be bulldozed in the spring. They had reached past all the money, past the stores and the land and the accounts, and they had taken the one thing that had no price, and they had sold it for one that did. That was the night the waiting ended. Not because of the cruelty to me, I had swallowed 2 years of that, but because of what it revealed. A person who would sell store number one did not simply have a busy schedule or a grief they processed differently or 100 small excuses I had been manufacturing for 2 years by that window. A person who would sell store number one had nothing inside them that I had tried to put there. And I understood, finally, sitting in the cheapest room with my granddaughter's stricken face in front of me, that I had spent 2 years waiting for people who did not exist, mourning a relationship with children who had been replaced, dollar by dollar, gift by strangers who happened to share my blood and my name. Nora was not coming back to hold the family together. And the family, it turned out, had not been held together by love at all. It had been held together by her. And she was gone. And what was left when she set down the weight was this. I did not rage. I want you to understand the quality of what happened in me that night, because it is the same stillness I have carried my whole life, and it is the most useful thing I own. I did not shout. I did not weep. I did not call my son at midnight to scream at him. I got very quiet and very clear, the way I used to get on the floor of a store when the numbers weren't adding up and I knew someone was stealing, that cold, flat attention that comes before you act. Because I remembered, lying there, the card I had kept face down for 6 years. The revocable trust. The single thread that only I could cut. And for the first time in 2 years, I stopped thinking of it as a sad secret I would carry to my grave and started thinking of it as what it actually was. A key to a cage my children did not know they were standing inside. The next morning I asked Rosa to do me a favor that had nothing to do with coffee. I asked her to help me make a phone call my children didn't know about, to a lawyer who wasn't theirs. I need to explain the shape of the trap I was in because it was tighter than you might think, and it is the same trap a great many old people are in without knowing it. My children controlled almost everything about my daily life. They controlled the trust's money, so they controlled Fairhaven, which meant in a sense they controlled the roof over my head. Richard had, over the 2 years, quietly positioned himself as the manager of my affairs. My mail went to his office to keep it organized. My accounts were watched, and I had learned that the staff at Fairhaven, who were kind enough as people, ultimately took direction from whoever paid the bills, and that was Richard. An old man in a care home who wants to make a private legal move against the very children who control his money, and his housing is not as free as you'd think. If I had picked up the room phone and called a lawyer, there was every chance it would get back to Richard before the ink was dry, and I did not yet know what my children would do if they understood I still held the thread. But I suspected, and I turned out to be right, that if they realized the trust was revocable, they would move fast and hard to take that power away from me, and the way to take it away from an 80-year-old is not subtle. You get him declared incompetent. You find a friendly doctor, you point at his age and his forgetfulness and his grief, and you go to a court and you ask for guardianship, and if you get it, the old man can never revoke anything again because he is no longer legally a person who can sign. That was the race I was in, though my children didn't know the starting gun had fired. If I moved first, I could pull everything back. If they realized what I held and moved first, they could lock the cage forever with me inside it. So I moved carefully, and I moved through the 2 people at Fairhaven my children had never once thought to consider, because my children did not consider people who couldn't do anything for them. Rosa and Maddie. Rosa smuggled a cell phone to me, her own old one, and showed me how to use it, patient with my thick fingers, and told no one. And Maddie, my 16-year-old granddaughter taking 2 buses every other Saturday, became, without fully understanding what she was part of, my courier to the outside world. It was Maddie who looked up, on her phone, the name my old retired lawyer had given me years before as the sharpest estate attorney in the city, a woman named Miriam Katz. And it was on Rosa's smuggled phone, sitting in the cheapest room with the door closed while Rosa kept an eye on the hall, that I first called Miriam Katz and began, quietly, to take my life back. I have to tell you how strange and frightening those first calls were, because I think people imagine that a wealthy man always feels his own power, and the truth is that by then I did not feel powerful at all. I felt like a prisoner making a call he wasn't supposed to make. My hands shook the first time, and not from age. I was a man who had negotiated with banks and stared down suppliers and built 31 stores, reduced to whispering into a borrowed phone with the door shut, terrified that an aide would walk in, terrified that Richard would somehow find out, terrified in the particular way that only the old and the dependent know, the fear of a person whose housing and food and daily existence are all controlled by the very people he is moving against. That is the trap that holds so many old people silent, and I want to name it plainly for anyone listening who is inside it. They make you dependent, and then they count on the dependence to keep you quiet, and the cruelest part is that it works for years because the fear is real and the risk is real and the phone is heavy in your shaking hand. I made the call anyway. I want you to hear that. I was 80 years old and frightened and dependent, and I made the call anyway, and if I could do it from the cheapest room with a borrowed phone, then whatever room you are in, you can make yours too. Miriam came to Fairhaven herself, twice, both times signed into the visitor log under a false purpose Rosa arranged. A physical therapy consultant, because we could not risk Richard seeing a lawyer's name in the log. She was perhaps 60, sharp as a new blade, and when I laid out the whole of it for her, the trust, the children, the cheapest room, store number 1, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Mr. Delaney, I have done this work for 35 years, and I want to tell you something, because I think you need to hear it from a professional and not just from your own broken heart. What your children have done to you is not unusual. I see it every month. The specific cruelty of the cheaper room, that's new to me, that's a bad one. But the pattern is as old as inheritance itself. Children who receive a fortune from a living parent almost always begin, sooner or later, to experience that parent as an obstacle between themselves and the full enjoyment of it. Not always, but often. And the ones it happens to never see it coming, because they cannot believe the children they love could become the people the money makes them." Then she opened her folder and she looked at me over her glasses and she said, "But you, Mr. Delaney, did something almost no one does. You kept the trust revocable. Do you understand what that means? It means you are not a victim asking a court for mercy. It means you are the owner of everything, and your children are, legally speaking, house guests who have overstayed. The only question is whether you have the stomach to ask them to leave." She confirmed the thing I most needed to know and most feared. The trust was still fully revocable. I still held the thread. But she also confirmed the danger. In reviewing what she could quietly access, she found that my children had recently retained a new estate lawyer of their own, a firm that specialized in exactly this, and she said that a competent firm reviewing the trust would spot its revocability within an hour, and would advise my children to do precisely what I feared, to secure my signature on a conversion to an irrevocable trust, or failing that, to seek guardianship. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "if they've hired who I think they've hired, then you do not have months. You may not have weeks. Somewhere in an office across town, a young associate is about to read page 4 of your trust and understand what you understand, and the moment they do, your son will come to you with a document and a pen and a very good reason you should sign. When he does, you cannot sign it. And the safest thing, the only truly safe thing, is for us to revoke the entire trust before that happens." And I looked at Miriam Katz, and I thought about my 3 children, and I thought about Nora, and I asked her to give me 3 days. Not because I doubted. Because a man who is about to take back everything from his own children should sit with it for 3 days first, if he is any kind of man at all. She didn't like it, but she gave me the 3 days. I spent them with Nora. Not at her grave. I couldn't get to it. Another small cruelty of the cheapest room, that I could not even visit my own wife. I spent them with Nora the way I do, in my head, in the long nights, laying it all out to her and listening for what she would say. On the first of those 3 nights, I did not wrestle with the decision at all. I just missed her. So badly it frightened me, and I lay in the cheapest room and remembered the 2 of us dancing between the aisles of store number 1 the night it first turned a profit, with the lights off so no one would see, Nora in her apron still smelling of the deli counter, both of us laughing at how tired we were, how broke, how happy. I remembered how she used to say, when the work was hardest, "We're building something, Frank, not the store. The store's just where we're doing it." And I understood, lying there 50 years later, that she had been right, that the store was never the thing, that the thing was the 2 of us and then the 5 of us, and that the family was what had actually failed, was the structure that had actually collapsed when she died, and that all my grief about the money was really grief about that, about the fact that the us she and I had built had not survived her, had turned out to be held up by her alone. That was the first night. The second and third were the ones where I wrestled. And I want to tell you honestly what the struggle was, because it was real, and if you are ever in my chair you will face it too. The struggle was not whether my children deserved it. They did. The struggle was whether doing it would make me into something Nora wouldn't recognize. I kept hearing the objection, the one you may be forming right now. They're still your children, Frank. Blood is blood. A father doesn't take back what he's given. A father forgives. And for 2 of those 3 nights, that objection held me. Because I am a father, and the habit of forgiving my children was 40 years deep, and the thought of Richard and Diane and Kevin with nothing, of having done that to them, sat in my chest like a stone. And then, on the 3rd night, Nora answered me the way she always does, which is to say I finally remembered who she actually was instead of who my guilt wanted her to be. Because my Nora was not a soft woman. She was a kind woman, which is a different and much stronger thing. And I remembered something she said once, years ago, when Kevin was a teenager and had stolen from the register and I wanted to let it go because he was my son, and Nora would not let me. She said, "Frank, if you protect him from what he did, you're not loving him, you're loving how it feels to be the one who forgives. And that's about you, not him. The kindest thing you can do for a person who's done wrong is let the truth land on them. While there's still time for it to change them. Let the truth land on them while there's still time." That was Nora. And I understood, on the 3rd night, that revoking the trust was not vengeance, and it was not the end of my love for my children. It was the last lesson I had left to teach them, the one Nora would have insisted on, the truth landing on them at last, the only thing that might, even now, reach whatever was left of the children we'd raised in the aisles of those stores. I was not going to destroy my children. I was going to do the hardest thing a parent can do, which is to stop protecting them from the consequences of who they had chosen to become. And I was going to make very sure, before I did, that the one grandchild who still had a soul, and the one aide who had shown me more family than my blood ever did, were protected and provided for, no matter what the storm took. So before I cut the thread, I built. That is the order of it, and the order matters because a man who tears down before he protects is just angry, but a man who protects before he tears down is a builder to the last. With Miriam, quietly, over those 3 days and the days right after, I put things in place. I established a separate, ironclad education trust for Maddie, fully funded, that her father could never touch and never even know the full size of, so that whatever happened to Richard, my granddaughter's future was set in stone. I made provision for Rosa, and for her mother 2 states away, enough that Rosa would never again have to choose between her rent and visiting the woman who raised her. And I made a list, a long one, of the people who had been loyal to me and to the company over 40 years, the store managers and the old-timers, the ones my children had begun to squeeze for efficiencies. And I made sure that when control came back to me, they would be safe. I protected everyone worth protecting. And only then, with the innocent standing on solid ground, did I tell Miriam I was ready. And then, of course, because trouble comes exactly when you're finally ready to meet it, Richard called. He was coming to visit. He had a document he needed me to sign. Just a formality, he said. Just some paperwork to tidy up the trust. The race had reached its final stretch, and my son fired the starting gun without knowing I was already running. I knew what the document was before I ever saw it. Miriam had told me exactly what it would be, and here it came, right on the schedule she'd predicted. Richard's new lawyers had read page 4. They had understood what I understood. And now my eldest son was driving to Fairhaven with a conversion document in his briefcase. A document that would turn my revocable trust into an irrevocable one, that would slam the cage door shut forever and throw away the key, and he was going to smile at me and call it a formality and put a pen in my hand, and he had no idea, none, that his father already knew, that his father had a lawyer of his own, that the confused, forgetful old man he'd tucked away in the cheapest room was 3 days from cutting the thread that held up my son's entire life. I had one job when Richard came. I had to not sign, and I had to not let him see, not for 1 second, that I understood what the document was, because if he understood that I understood, he would move to guardianship and the race would change. I had to be exactly what he believed I was. Old, tired, grateful for the visit, confused about paperwork, harmless. I had spent 80 years letting people underestimate me. I had one more performance in me, the most important of my life, and my son was the audience. He came on a Thursday. He brought no gift, of course, and he brought no warmth, but he brought something he hadn't brought in 2 years, a kind of attentiveness, and I understood it for what it was. A man handling a delicate transaction. He sat in the one chair in the cheapest room, and he looked around it with a flicker of distaste he didn't bother hiding, at the view of the dumpsters, at the smallness of it, the room he had chosen for me to save $200, and he did not connect that room to himself at all. And he made small talk, badly, for a few minutes, and then he took the document out of his briefcase and slid it across my little table, the same table where Maddie did her homework, and he uncapped a pen and he said, "Dad, I need you to sign this. It's nothing to worry about, just some trust housekeeping the lawyers want. Cleans up some old language, makes everything simpler. Right here at the bottom." And I looked at my son. And I want to tell you, the temptation in that moment was enormous, the temptation to do it right there, to look him in the eye and tell him I knew, to watch his face change. But that is exactly the mistake that costs you everything, the ego that needs the enemy to know, and 40 years in business had burned that ego out of me. So instead I did the hardest and smartest thing. I picked up the document in my old hands, and I looked at it, and I let my hands tremble a little, and I frowned at it the way a confused old man frowns, and I said, "What is it again? My eyes aren't good. Read me the top part, son." And I made him sit there and start to explain it, and then I let my attention wander on purpose, and I asked him about Maddie, out of nowhere, how was Maddie doing in school? And I watched him get impatient, and I said, "I'm awfully tired today, Richard. The medication makes everything foggy in the afternoons. I don't think I should sign anything important when I'm foggy. Your mother always said never sign when you're tired." I used Nora on him the way he'd once used her on me, and I watched it work, watched him decide that pushing a foggy old man to sign would look bad if it ever came up, and he capped the pen with a tight little sound of frustration and said he'd leave the document with me and come back next week. And I said that would be fine, and thank you for coming, and it was good to see him, and I watched my son leave the cheapest room believing he had a week. He had, though he did not know it, about 36 hours. Because the moment his car left the parking lot, I called Miriam Katz on Rose's smuggled phone, and I said 3 words. "He came today." And Miriam said, "Then we go tomorrow. Everything's ready. I'll be there at 10. I did not sleep that last night in the cheapest room, the night before I would cut the thread. I sat in my chair by the window in the dark, and I watched the delivery lot, the trucks coming and going under the sodium lights, and I held in my mind the full weight of what I was about to do one last time, because a man should. Somewhere across the city, my 3 children were asleep in houses my money had bought, dreaming, if they dreamed of me at all, of an old man safely tucked away who would sign what he was told and die on schedule and stop being an expense. And I sat in the dark and I made my peace with the fact that when the sun came up I would become, to them, the villain of their story, the father who took it all back, the cruel old man, and that they would tell it that way to anyone who would listen for the rest of their lives, and that not one of them would ever put in the story the cheapest room, or the cake with the candle that a stranger brought, or the 2 buses, or store number 1 with its ceiling coming down in the spring. I would be the villain. I made my peace with that too, because I had finally understood, in that dark, the thing Nora knew all along. That you cannot control the story other people tell about you, you can only control whether you did the right thing, and that a man who needs the people he's disciplining to also approve of the discipline is not really a parent. He's a coward hoping to be thanked for his courage. I was not going to be thanked. I was going to be the villain. And I was, at last, at peace with it, sometime around 4 in the morning, watching the trucks in the cheapest room on the last night I would ever spend as a forgotten man. If you have made it this far into an old man's story, let me ask you the question I most need answered before I tell you how it ended, because it is the question I had to answer alone in that room, and I want to know what you would have chosen. If your children had put you in the cheapest room and forgotten you, if they had sold the one sacred thing you had left, and you held in your hand the power to take back everything you'd ever given them, would you use it? Or would the fact that they were your children stop your hand? Even now, even after everything, would you cut the thread? Or would you keep waiting by the window? Tell me in the comments, honestly, and tell me if you've ever had to make a choice like it, because I promise you someone reading this is holding a thread of their own tonight and does not know whether they are allowed to cut it. Tell them. I'll tell you what I did. Miriam came at 10 the next morning, signed in once more as a physical therapy consultant, and she brought a notary and every document we needed, and in the cheapest room in the Fairhaven Senior Care Home, at the little table where my granddaughter did her homework and my son had tried to trick me the day before, I signed a single page that revoked the Delaney family trust in its entirety. One signature. And with that signature, everything my children believed they owned ceased, in an instant, to be theirs. The 31 stores, the land beneath them, the accounts, the properties, all of it, every dollar and every acre, snapped back into my sole ownership, overnight, completely legally, exactly as I had quietly kept the power to make it do for 6 years. The thread was cut, and the whole weight of the Delaney fortune, which had been hanging over my children's heads the entire time without their knowing it, came down. And the very first thing I did with it, before I dealt with a single one of my children, was save store number 1. Miriam had already found the sale. It had not yet closed. These things move slowly, and the demolition Maddie had mentioned was still months off. And because the trust that had sold it had never actually owned it, because I did, the sale was built on sand, and Miriam unwound it in a matter of days. I bought back my own store, the store that had never legally left me, and I killed the condominium deal. And I want to tell you that when Miriam called me on Rose's phone to say it was done, that store number 1 was safe, that the wrecking ball would never come, I sat in the cheapest room and I looked out at the dumpsters and I said out loud to Nora, "I saved it, love. I saved our store." And it was the first time in 2 years that the cheapest room did not feel like a place I was waiting to die. It felt like a place I had finally started to fight from. Then I dealt with my children. And here is where you learn the difference, the one Nora taught me, between vengeance and a lesson, because I could have destroyed them, and I did not, though I destroyed the thing they had become. They found out the way you find out that the ground is gone, all at once and too late. Richard discovered it first, at the office, my office, when a transaction wouldn't clear and a banker who had known me for 30 years gently informed him that authority on the accounts had reverted to Mr. Frank Delaney, Sr., effective immediately by legal instruction. I am told my son went white. I am told he made phone calls to his lawyers, to the bank, to Diane, to Kevin, and that within a few hours all 3 of my children understood that the fortune they had been living inside of, spending, leveraging, borrowing against, building their whole identities on top of, was simply gone. Returned to the old man in the cheapest room they had not visited in months, the old man they had moved to save $200, the old man they had been about to trick into signing away his last power. And all 3 of them, for the first time in 2 years, got in their cars and drove to Fairhaven. All 3, together, on the same afternoon. It took the loss of every dollar to accomplish what my 80th birthday could not. It got all 3 of my children through the door of the cheapest room at the same time. Sit with that. I have had to. They came in like a storm, and I was ready for them, and I want to describe what I saw when they came through that door, because it was the most important thing I saw in the whole affair. I saw fear, not remorse, not shame, not, God help me, even in that first moment, any recognition of what they had done. Fear. The specific animal fear of people who have just lost their money. And nothing else, no grief for a father wronged, no dawning understanding, just the raw terror of the suddenly poor. Richard's face was a business negotiation already in progress. Diane was crying, but I knew my daughter's crying. And these were the tears of a woman who had just been told she would have to give up her house. Not the tears of a daughter who had wronged her father. And Kevin, my baby, charming Kevin, was already, I could see it, already assembling the smile, the one that had talked customers into anything since he was 6, getting ready to charm his way back into the fortune. Not one of them, coming through the door of the room they had exiled me to, looked at the room. Not one of them saw the dumpsters out the window and understood. They saw only the money, still, even now, only the money. Richard spoke first because he always does. He tried, at first, the reasonable voice, the concerned son voice, the one he'd used to get me to divide the estate in the first place. "Dad," he said, "there's obviously been some confusion, some mistake with the lawyers. Let's fix this. Let's sit down and fix this like a family." And I let him talk. I let all 3 of them talk in turn because I wanted to hear it, wanted to hear whether even now, even with the money gone and their whole lives hanging on my mercy, a single one of them would say the thing that could have changed it. I waited for one of them to say, "I'm sorry, Dad." I waited for one of them to say, "We forgot you, and it was wrong." I waited for one of them to look around the cheapest room and understand. And not one of them did. They argued. They pleaded. Diane said I was being cruel. Kevin said he had debts, real debts, that people were going to come after him. Richard, when the reasonable voice failed, showed me the other one, the cold one, and said I was clearly not competent, that a man who would do this to his own children obviously wasn't in his right mind, and that they would be speaking to lawyers about my capacity. He threatened me with exactly the weapon I'd been afraid of, guardianship, right there in the cheapest room, my own son, and he did not know that Miriam Katz had already documented my competence 6 ways from Sunday in preparation for exactly that threat, and that it was empty. And when they had all finished, when the storm had blown itself out and the 3 of them stood there in the small room they had chosen for me, waiting to see what the old man would do, I finally spoke. And I did not shout. I have never once in this whole story shouted, and I did not start then. I spoke quietly, the way Nora used to speak when she wanted to be truly heard, and I told them the truth, and it was the truth landing on them at last, the way she taught me while there was still time. Sit down, I said. All three of you. You came in here without once asking how I am. So before we talk about your money, you're going to stand in this room and actually look at it for the first time. And something in my voice, some old authority they hadn't heard from me since they were children in the aisles of the stores, made them go quiet, and Richard sat, and then Diane, and then Kevin in the one chair and on the edge of the bed in the cheapest room, and for the first time I watched them actually see it. This is the room you chose for me, I said. Not the first one. This one. You moved me here from a room that looked at a garden because this one costs $200 a month less. $200 out of a fortune of tens of millions that you believed was yours, was more than you were willing to spend so that your father could look at something alive while he waited for you to visit. I want you to understand that I know that. I have known it since the day Rosa told me, and I have sat in this chair at that window looking at those dumpsters for 2 years, waiting for one of you to come. Not for money, just to come. Diane started to speak and I raised my hand, and she stopped, and I went on. In 2 years, I said, the three of you visited me 7 times. Richard twice, both times to make me sign something. Diane once at Christmas, and you left because the smell gave you a headache. Kevin 4 times, every one of them for a check. I kept count, not out of bitterness, out of hope. I kept thinking the next visit would be the one that wasn't about the money. It never came. And do you know who did come? Do you know who took 2 city buses every other Saturday for 2 years? Without telling any of you, because she knew you'd disapprove of the wasted time. I looked at Richard, your daughter, Maddie, the one person carrying my blood who understands that she comes from something. She made me the only real card I got on my 80th birthday, the birthday not one of you remembered. She sat at that table and asked me about your mother, about store number 1, because she wanted to know what she came from, while the 3 of you were busy selling it. That reached Richard. I saw it, the mention of Maddie, the first crack in the negotiation on his face. But I did not stop because I was not finished, and the truth was not finished landing. You sold store number 1, I said, and my voice did not shake, but it cost me not to let it. The store your mother and I bought with money we didn't have. The rooms where Richard was born. You sold it to be knocked down for condominiums, and you divided the money, and you didn't tell me because you didn't think the old man would care that the heart of his whole life was going under a wrecking ball. That was the thing that finally taught me what I'd refused to learn for 2 years. That the children your mother and I raised are gone. Not dead. Worse, replaced $1 at a time by people who look like you and carry my name and cannot spare their father an afternoon or their family's history a single thought. I gave you a fortune, and the fortune didn't corrupt you. It just gave you the room to show me who you already were. That is the hardest thing I have ever had to understand, and I understood it in this room at that window. And then I told them what was going to happen, and this is the part where you learn what Nora meant because I did not do to them what they had done to me. Here is what happens now, I said. Everything has come back to me because it was always mine. I never once stopped owning it, and every one of you forgot that a revocable trust is exactly what its name says. The stores are mine. The land is mine. The money is mine. Store number 1 is saved. The sale is dead. It will never be torn down while I breathe, and after I'm gone it will belong to the one person in this family who understands what it is. As for the 3 of you, I looked at each of them in turn. I am not going to put you in the cheapest room. I am not the person you taught me you would be. You will not be destitute. Each of you will receive a modest allowance, enough to live decently, not enough to live as you have been living. The houses bought with my money will be sold, and you will find places you can afford on what you actually earn, which for 2 of you is nothing, and you will learn at 50 and 48 and 45, the thing your mother and I were never hard enough to teach you when it might have been easier, what a dollar costs to make. The company will be run by professionals who care about the 900 people who work there, overseen by me for as long as I last, and then held in trust for the community and for Maddie, who will inherit not just money but the understanding of what it's for. You are my children. I will not abandon you, but I am done protecting you from the consequences of who you have chosen to be. Your mother told me once that the kindest thing you can do for someone who's done wrong is let the truth land on them while there's still time to change. This is the truth. It has landed. What you do with the time is, at last, up to you. Kevin cried. Diane raged. Richard went cold and silent, and I could see him already calculating the legal angles, and I let him. Miriam had closed every one of them before he ever walked in. They left the cheapest room that day with nothing but an allowance and the truth, and I sat back down in my chair by the window, and Rosa came in a little later and found me there, and she didn't ask what had happened, she just sat with me, which is what family does. The collapse of the lives my children had built on my money played out over the following months, and I watched it the way you watch whether you have no wish to see but cannot look away from. Diane's world went first, because it was the most fragile, being made entirely of appearance. The big house in the Voss family's neighborhood was sold, and when the money went, so did the social world she'd spent 15 years scrubbing the grocery store off herself to enter, because that world keeps you only as long as you can pay the dues, and the friends who'd never known her father was in retail melted away the moment the check stopped, and my daughter learned, at 48, the thing Nora could have told her for free, that people who love you for your house do not love you. Kevin's collapse was louder because he had not merely spent my money, he had borrowed against the expectation of it, run up debts with people who do not send polite letters, and when the fortune vanished those debts came due against a charming man with no income and no idea how to make one. And for the first time in his life Kevin's smile did not solve the problem. I paid off enough of it quietly to keep him from real harm because I am his father but not a dollar more, and Kevin had to take a job, an actual job, at 45, and I am told he was bad at it at first and slightly less bad at it later, which is the most hopeful sentence I can honestly write about my youngest. And Richard lost the only thing he had ever truly valued, which was not the money but the identity, the CEO, the important man, the name on the office door, and when I brought in professionals to run the company he had run so coldly, Richard discovered that, without my name behind him, he was an ordinary middle-aged executive with a difficult reputation and no particular gifts, and the doors he'd always believed opened for him had, it turned out, only ever opened for me. I did not enjoy watching any of it. I felt, watching my children fall, the particular grief of a man seeing the final proof of a thing he'd hoped all along he was wrong about. But I did not stop it, and I did not soften it past the allowance, because Nora's voice was in my ear the whole time. Let the truth land on them while there's still time. Some people need to lose everything that was given before they can value anything they earn. I gave my children that loss. It was the last gift I had, and the hardest, and I am still not certain any of them will ever understand that it was one. And I looked out at the dumpsters and the delivery lot one last time, because I knew now that I would not be looking at them much longer. I moved out of Fairhaven 3 weeks later. Not because there is anything wrong with Fairhaven. Rosa is there, and Rosa is one of the finest people I have ever known. But a man who owns 31 grocery stores does not need to die in the cheapest room to save $200. And I had only ever been there because my children put me there. I bought a house again. A real one, with a garden, because I had learned that a view of something alive matters more than I'd known when I let them take the first one from me. And I did not live in it alone. Maddie's situation at home had become difficult, as you can imagine, once her father lost everything and learned that his own daughter had been my one loyal visitor. Richard, being who he is, found a way to blame a 16-year-old for his ruin. So Maddie came to live with me, with her parents' grudging permission and her own whole heart, and she finished high school from my house with the garden, and she is at university now on the education trust one built before I ever cut the thread, studying business, because she says she wants to run Delaney's Markets someday the right way, the way her great-grandmother ran that first register on Delancey Street. And I believe she will. She is the only one of them who ever asked me what store number 1 meant. That is how you know where to put a legacy. Not into the hands that reach for the money. Into the hands that reach for the meaning. And I hired Rosa away from Fairhaven, at a wage that made her cry, to manage the house and, more than that, to be what she had already become, family. Her mother lives with us now too, moved from 2 states away, in a sunny room on the ground floor, and some evenings the 4 of us have dinner together, Rosa and her mother and Maddie and me, and it is louder and warmer and more like a family than my own house has been since Nora died, and not one person at that table shares my blood, and every one of them is my family, because family, I have finally learned at 80 years old, is not the people who are owed to you. It is the people who come. It is the people who take 2 buses. It is the people who tell you the truth about the room. It is the people who sit with you and don't ask what happened. Blood makes relatives. Showing up makes family. And if you have to choose between the two, and I pray you never do, but if you have to, choose the ones who show up. Every time. Store number 1 still stands on Delancey Street. I go there sometimes. I had it restored, not modernized, restored. The old tin ceiling, the worn wooden floor I mopped 10,000 times. And it is a working grocery again, a small one. And above the door there is a brass plate that reads, Delaney's Market Number 1, EST 1966, founded by Frank and Nora Delaney, who started here with nothing but each other. Maddie chose the words. And there is a bench inside, by the window where Nora's register used to be, and I sit on it sometimes and watch the neighborhood come in for their bread and their milk, the children and the old people and the tired parents, and I think about the 2 kids we were, Nora and me, with our impossible faith in each other, and I am at peace. I saved it. Whatever else I got wrong in 80 years, and I got a great deal wrong, I saved the one thing that was never really about the money at all. I go to Nora now, too, whenever I want, which is a freedom I did not have in the cheapest room and will never take for granted again. Maddie drives me, or Rosa does, out to the cemetery on the hill, and I sit by my wife's stone and I tell her everything, the way I always have, except now I can do it out loud, with my hand on the cold granite, instead of in the dark of a room by the dumpsters. I told her about all of it. I told her I'd saved the store. I told her about the cheapest room and the cake with the candle and the 2 buses. And I told her the thing I most needed to say, which was that I was sorry. Sorry that I hadn't been the wall she was. Sorry that I'd mistaken giving our children everything for raising them well. Sorry that it had taken me until 80 and the cheapest room to learn the lesson she tried to teach me across a kitchen table 40 years before. And sitting there, I felt her answer me the way she does, and it was not absolution exactly. Nora was never one for easy comfort. It was more like a hand on my shoulder, the real kind, the kind that means you did the hard right thing in the end, old man, and that's all any of us can do is get there in the end. I planted something at her grave, a small garden, because Nora always needed something alive around her, and I tend it myself on my knees like an old fool, and I do not care who sees. She pulled a wagon of food through the snow to people who couldn't pay, when we had nothing. The least I can do, now that I have everything back, is keep something blooming for her on a hill. Here is what I learned, and it is the only thing I have to give you at the end of all this. If you are a parent, hear me, because I am speaking to you from the far side of the mistake, and I would give a great deal to spare you it. Do not measure your children's love by what they say when they want something. Measure it by who comes when you have nothing left to give. The day will come, if you are lucky enough to grow old, when you are no longer useful to anyone, when you cannot advance a career or write a check or open a door, and on that day you will find out what you actually built, and it will not be the business or the fortune or the name. It will be the answer to one simple question. When you are sitting in the cheapest room, by a window that looks at nothing, on a birthday no one remembered, who takes the 2 buses? Build for that. Whatever else you build, build for that. Because that is the only inheritance that matters, in the end, the only one that visits you, and no fortune on earth can buy it and no trust can protect it, and it cannot be divided or revoked. It can only be earned slowly by both of you over a lifetime, and if you have it, if there is one person who would take the 2 buses, then you are richer than I was with 31 stores, and you should go and tell them so today, right now, before you finish listening to an old man, because the time is so much shorter than you think. And if you are the one in the cheapest room right now, if you are the one by the window waiting for the call that isn't coming, then hear this from someone who sat exactly where you are sitting for 2 years too long. Your worth is not measured by who forgot you. The people who put you in the cheapest room to save $200 have told you who they are, not who you are. And you are allowed. You are allowed to stop waiting. You are allowed to stop making excuses for people who have shown you, again and again, exactly what you mean to them. You are allowed to take back what is yours, your money, your dignity, your peace, your one sacred thing. It is not cruelty to stop being a victim. It is not vengeance to let the truth land on the people who wronged you. Your mother or someone who loved you once would tell you the same thing mine told me. The kindest thing you can do for someone who's done you wrong is let the truth reach them, while there's still time. Cut the thread if you're holding one. Save your store number 1, whatever it is, and go find the people who would take the 2 buses, because I promise you they are out there, and they are the only family that was ever real. My name is Frank Delaney. I sat alone in the cheapest room on my 80th birthday, and I waited for 3 children who did not come, and I had every reason in the world to believe I was a foolish, forgotten old man with nothing left. And I was wrong. I still held the key to everything, and I always had, and the moment I found the courage to turn it, I discovered that I had a granddaughter who took 2 buses, and an aide who told me the truth, and a store on Delancey Street that a wrecking ball would never touch, and a family, a real one, waiting to be chosen. They put me in the cheapest room to save $200. They forgot that the quiet old man they tucked away had built everything they were standing on, and could take it back with a single signature, and would, the day he finally understood who had really come for him. If someone has put you in the cheapest room, stop listening to my story now, and go turn your own key. Say the thing. Take the 2 buses to the person who'd take them for you. Do it today. Do it before there's a window and a birthday and no one at the door. That's the whole lesson. That's the only thing I have. It's never too late to find out who your family really is. But please, for your own sake, don't wait as long as I did to look.